In the heart of Germany, hidden in the dense forests of the Ettersberg Hill near the city of Weimar, a place of unimaginable suffering once stood. Its name was Buchenwald, one of the largest and most notorious concentration camps of the Nazi era. To the outside world it appeared as just another part of Hitler's vast network of terror. But to those who passed through its gates, marked by the cynical inscription "Jedem das Sein," to each his own, Buchenwald was a world of cruelty, starvation, torture, and death. This is the story of Buchenwald, not merely a story of barbed wire and guard towers, but of the men, women, and children who suffered within, and of the Jewish lives destroyed in a relentless campaign of hatred. It is a story of persecution, of systematic annihilation, and of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the darkest evil mankind has ever known. Buchenwald's story begins before the outbreak of the Second World War. In July 1937, construction began on a concentration camp near Weimar, a city long celebrated as the cultural heart of Germany, home to Goethe and Schiller, the cradle of humanism and art. It was an intentional irony. The Nazi regime wanted to demonstrate that even a place of enlightenment could be overshadowed by the ideology of hate. Initially, Buchenwald was designed not as a death camp, but as a site of imprisonment and forced labor for political opponents of the Nazi regime, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other enemies of the state. But as Hitler's plans grew more radical and genocidal, so too did Buchenwald's purpose. It would evolve from a prison into a killing ground, from a place of punishment into a machine of extermination. The camp was under the direct command of the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units. Its first commandant, Karl Otto Koch, was a fanatical Nazi known for his brutality and corruption. Together with his wife, Ilse Koch, later infamous as the Witch of Buchenwald, he turned the camp into a kingdom of sadism and terror. Prisoners were beaten to death for minor infractions. They were starved, worked to exhaustion, and subjected to grotesque punishments. For the SS, Buchenwald was not merely a camp, it was a laboratory of power. In the early years, Jewish prisoners were a minority in Buchenwald. Most inmates were political prisoners, with Jews comprising only a small percentage. But that changed dramatically after Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues burned, Jewish businesses were looted, and tens of thousands of Jews were rounded up by the Gestapo. More than 10,000 of them were sent to Buchenwald in a single wave. For many, it was their first encounter with the full brutality of the Nazi state. These men, rabbis, shopkeepers, doctors, lawyers, had committed no crime other than being Jewish. Inside the camp, they were stripped of their belongings, their names replaced with numbers, their humanity systematically erased. They were beaten during roll calls, forced to work without food or water, and subjected to random killings. Hundreds died within weeks. Kristallnacht marked a turning point. It was a clear signal that Buchenwald, like the entire Nazi system, was shifting from persecution to annihilation. Jews were no longer seen as enemies to be marginalized. They were enemies to be eliminated. By the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Buchenwald had become a central node in the Nazi concentration camp network. Its population ballooned, reaching tens of thousands as Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and prisoners of war were crammed into its barracks. By 1945, more than 280,000 people from over 30 countries would pass through Buchenwald's gates. An estimated 56,000 would never leave. Life inside the camp was designed to break the human spirit. Prisoners rose before dawn for roll call, standing motionless for hours regardless of weather, sometimes beside the bodies of those who had died during the night. They were given a watery soup and a piece of stale bread for breakfast, a diet that led to slow starvation. The workday stretched for up to 14 hours, often in the camp's stone quarry or armaments factories under brutal supervision. Those who faltered were beaten or shot. For Jewish prisoners, conditions were even worse. They were singled out for the most grueling labor and the harshest punishments. They were humiliated, forced to perform meaningless tasks designed to degrade them. Guards frequently staged mock executions or public beatings, often killing Jews for sport. It was part of a calculated effort to dehumanize them, to turn them into shadows before extinguishing their lives. In the twisted world of Nazi ideology, Jews were not merely enemies. They were subhuman, a supposed biological threat to the purity of the Aryan race. Buchenwald became one of the centers where this deadly pseudoscience was put into practice. SS doctors and scientists conducted horrific experiments on prisoners, many of them Jews. They infected them with typhus to test vaccines. They subjected them to freezing experiments, starvation tests, and chemical injections. Prisoners were mutilated and dissected without anesthesia. Hundreds died in agony, their bodies reduced to data points in a racist fantasy of racial science. One of the most infamous figures was Dr. Waldemar Hoven, Buchenwald's chief physician. Hoven carried out lethal injections, performed brutal experiments, and was directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of inmates. After the war, he would be tried and executed for war crimes, but his victims never had the chance to speak for themselves. As the Holocaust intensified in the early 1940s, Buchenwald became a way station for Jews deported from across Europe. Many were sent on to extermination camps like Auschwitz. But thousands remained, and for them, the worst horrors awaited in what became known as the Little Camp. The Little Camp was a section within Buchenwald reserved for Jewish prisoners and other groups deemed unfit or undesirable. It was a place of deliberate neglect and extermination. Overcrowded beyond belief, with hundreds crammed into spaces meant for dozens, the Little Camp was a breeding ground for disease. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Starvation was rampant. Prisoners were too weak to work, and those who could no longer stand were often left to die. The death rate in the Little Camp was astronomical. In the winter of 1944–45, as the Nazis crammed thousands of Jews from evacuated camps into Buchenwald, hundreds died every day. Their bodies were piled like cordwood outside the barracks, awaiting transport to the camp's crematorium. Amid the horror, however, there were glimmers of humanity. A clandestine resistance movement emerged within Buchenwald, composed mainly of political prisoners, communists, socialists, and anti-fascists. These men and women risked their lives to smuggle food to weaker prisoners, hide children, forge documents, and sabotage Nazi operations from within. Some even helped Jewish inmates survive by swapping identification tags or assigning them to less deadly work details. These acts of defiance, though small, were acts of extraordinary courage in a place where discovery meant certain death. Perhaps the most remarkable example of resistance came in the camp's final days. As Allied forces advanced in April 1945, the SS began evacuating prisoners and destroying evidence of their crimes. But the Buchenwald resistance, armed with weapons smuggled and stolen over months, seized control of the camp. On April 11, 1945, they rose up, disarmed the remaining guards, and liberated Buchenwald themselves, hours before American troops arrived. When soldiers of the U.S. 6th Armored Division entered Buchenwald, they were unprepared for what they found. Thousands of emaciated prisoners stumbled out of barracks, their skeletal frames barely human. Piles of corpses filled the crematorium yard. The stench of death hung in the air. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon visiting other camps, ordered that journalists and civilians be brought in to witness the horrors firsthand, so that no one could deny what had happened. At Buchenwald, the world saw the evidence of Nazi barbarism, evidence that would later form the backbone of the war crimes trials at Nuremberg. Among the survivors liberated that day were hundreds of Jewish children, many of them orphans. Some would go on to become writers, artists, and scholars, dedicating their lives to telling the story of Buchenwald so that it would never be forgotten. In the spring of 1942, as the Nazi campaign of extermination reached its peak, Buchenwald entered a new and even darker phase. The final solution, Hitler's plan for the complete annihilation of Europe's Jewish population, was now official state policy. Mass deportations were underway across the continent. Jews were being herded from their homes, rounded up in ghettos, and loaded into trains bound for extermination camps in the east. But for tens of thousands, Buchenwald became an unexpected stop along that road to destruction. From Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and occupied Western Europe, trains began to arrive more frequently at the gates of Buchenwald. Many of the prisoners who disembarked were exhausted and disoriented. They had been torn from their families, transported for days without food or water, and had no idea where they were. Some believed they were being resettled. Others knew with a heavy certainty that they were entering a place of death. For Jewish prisoners, Buchenwald was rarely the final destination. It functioned both as a labor camp and a transit hub, a place where inmates were held temporarily before being sent to extermination centers like Auschwitz, Sobibor, or Treblinka. But the time spent in Buchenwald could still be fatal. Many never survived long enough to board the next train. Those who were selected for work were assigned to grueling tasks that pushed their bodies to the breaking point. Some were forced into the quarry, breaking rocks under the watchful eyes of SS guards. Others were sent to nearby factories producing armaments for the German war machine. Conditions were brutal. Days stretched into nights without rest, and meals consisted of watery soup and a scrap of bread, insufficient to sustain life. Malnutrition and exhaustion claimed thousands. The Nazi regime had a chilling efficiency when it came to stripping individuals of their humanity, and nowhere was this more evident than in Buchenwald. Upon arrival, prisoners were registered, stripped of their belongings, and shaved. Their names were replaced with numbers. Their clothes were replaced with striped uniforms marked with coloured triangles that identified their supposed crimes. Jews wore a yellow triangle, often paired with another, red for political prisoners, green for criminals, pink for homosexuals. This simple system allowed guards to single them out instantly for extra cruelty. But dehumanization extended beyond clothing. Jewish prisoners were denied access to the limited privileges other inmates might earn. They were often housed separately in the worst barracks, assigned the most exhausting labor, and targeted for public humiliation. SS guards frequently beat them without reason, forced them to crawl on all fours, or staged sadistic games in which they were ordered to fight one another for scraps of food. This cruelty was not random, it was ideological. It was designed to reinforce the Nazi belief that Jews were subhuman. It was a daily performance of power, a way for the SS to turn people into objects before destroying them. In this, Buchenwald was not merely a place of physical suffering, it was a machine of psychological annihilation. As the tide of war turned against Germany in 1943 and 1944, the SS sought to accelerate the extermination process. Buchenwald, already overcrowded, became a key link in a vast network of murder. Thousands of Jewish prisoners were loaded onto so-called death transports, trains bound for Auschwitz-Birkenau and other death camps. Many did not survive the journey. Conditions on these transports were horrific. Prisoners were packed into sealed cattle cars, sometimes more than 100 people to a single wagon, with no food, water, or sanitation. Journeys that should have taken a day lasted a week. By the time the trains reached their destination, many passengers were dead from dehydration, suffocation, or disease. Those who survived were usually sent straight to the gas chambers, but death could also come before departure. In 1944, as Allied bombing campaigns intensified, transport trains were often delayed for days or weeks. Prisoners, crammed into holding areas with little food or water, died in large numbers while waiting to be shipped to their deaths. The SS referred to these victims dismissively as natural losses, as if starvation and thirst were simply inevitable consequences of war rather than deliberate acts of murder. Among the most tragic stories to emerge from Buchenwald are those of the children. By 1944, thousands of Jewish children, many of them orphans from the ghettos and deportations, found themselves inside the camp. Some were brought from Hungary after the German occupation in March 1944. Others arrived from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France. Life for children in Buchenwald was unimaginably harsh. They were often separated from their parents upon arrival, forced to live in the squalid conditions of the little camp, or hidden in the barracks by other prisoners who sought to protect them. Many were subjected to medical experiments or killed outright because they were deemed unfit for labor. Yet, amid the horror, there were extraordinary acts of courage. The camp's underground resistance, led by political prisoners, worked tirelessly to save the children. They smuggled them into safer barracks, forged their identities, and assigned them to light work details to keep them alive. These efforts saved hundreds of young lives, including that of a boy named Eliezer Wiesel. Wiesel, later known as Elie Wiesel, would survive Buchenwald and go on to become one of the most powerful voices of Holocaust remembrance. In his memoir Night, he described the day of liberation. From the depths of the mirror, a corpse was contemplating me. The look in his eyes, as they stared into mine, has never left me. His words speak for the thousands of children who never left Buchenwald, and for those who did, carrying the scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives. While extermination camps were designed for immediate mass murder, Buchenwald was part of a different, though equally deadly, system: extermination through labor. The Nazis sought to squeeze every ounce of economic value from their prisoners before they died. This meant that even those who were not sent directly to the gas chambers were still marked for death, only by a slower method. Jewish prisoners were leased to private companies, including well-known German industrial giants like IG Farben and Siemens, which built factories near the camp to take advantage of the slave labor supply. They worked long hours in brutal conditions, producing weapons, aircraft parts, and other materials vital to the Nazi war effort. The mortality rate was staggering. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease took their toll, and beatings or executions awaited those who failed to meet production quotas. It was common for workers to collapse on the job, their bodies dragged away and replaced within hours. In this way, the Nazis fused industrial efficiency with genocidal intent, a system that reduced human lives to expendable tools in service of war and ideology. By early 1945, the Nazi Empire was crumbling. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and American and British troops were pushing from the west. As the front lines drew closer, the SS began evacuating camps in the east and relocating prisoners westward, a process known as the Death Marches. Tens of thousands of Jews, already starving and ill, were forced to march hundreds of kilometers in freezing conditions. Those who stumbled were shot. Thousands died along the way. Buchenwald became a dumping ground for the survivors of these marches. By March 1945, the camp's population had swelled to more than 80,000, far beyond its intended capacity. Overcrowding reached catastrophic levels. Barracks designed for 200 men now held more than 1,000. Sanitation collapsed. Typhus and dysentery swept through the camp, killing hundreds every day. The SS responded with characteristic brutality. Those too weak to work were executed or left to die. In the camp's final weeks, thousands of Jewish prisoners were murdered in mass shootings, hangings, or injections. The crematorium operated around the clock, unable to keep up with the flood of bodies. As Allied forces closed in, the Nazis attempted to destroy evidence of their crimes. Documents were burned, and orders were issued to evacuate or liquidate the remaining prisoners. But time was running out. Inside Buchenwald, the underground resistance knew that liberation was near. For months, they had been preparing for the moment when the SS would abandon the camp. Weapons had been smuggled in, hidden beneath floorboards or buried in the ground. A secret network of communication connected prisoners across barracks. Plans were drawn up for a final stand. On April 11, 1945, with American forces just a few kilometers away, the SS began evacuating the last prisoners. But before they could complete their task, the resistance struck. Prisoners stormed guard towers, overpowered remaining SS troops, and seized control of the camp. At 3:15 p.m., they raised a white flag above the main gate. Buchenwald, a place of terror for nearly 8 years, was free. Moments later, soldiers of the U.S. 6th Armored Division arrived to find the camp already in the hands of its inmates. They were greeted by survivors, skeletal, hollow-eyed, but alive. It was a moment of triumph amid unimaginable tragedy. The scenes that greeted the liberators were beyond comprehension. Piles of bodies lay unburied in the camp yard. Inside the barracks, survivors were too weak to stand, their bodies ravaged by starvation and disease. The crematorium was still warm from recent use. In the little camp, American troops found hundreds of children, many of them orphans, barely clinging to life. Journalists and photographers were brought in to document the horrors. Their images, of emaciated bodies, of mass graves, of haunted eyes staring into the camera, would soon shock the world. For many outside Germany, it was the first undeniable proof of the full scale of the Holocaust. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, deeply disturbed by what he saw in the camps, insisted that local German civilians be forced to tour the sites. At Buchenwald, hundreds of Weimar residents were marched through the gates and confronted with the atrocities committed in their name. Many wept. Others claimed ignorance, but none could deny the evidence before them. Liberation did not mean the end of Buchenwald's story. In the months and years that followed, efforts were made to bring the perpetrators to justice. At the Buchenwald trials in 1947, 31 former SS personnel were convicted of war crimes, including Ilse Koch, the infamous Witch of Buchenwald, who was accused of brutalizing prisoners and collecting souvenirs from their skin. Many of the camp's doctors, guards, and officials were executed. Others received lengthy prison sentences. For survivors, however, liberation marked the beginning of a new struggle. Many had lost their families, their homes, their health, and their faith in humanity. Some were too traumatized to speak of what they had endured for decades. Others, like Elie Wiesel, dedicated their lives to ensuring the world would never forget. Buchenwald itself remained a powerful symbol. The camp's barracks and crematorium were preserved as memorials. Museums and archives were established to educate future generations about the Holocaust and the dangers of hatred. Today, visitors from around the world walk through the gates where Jedem Dasein still hangs, a grim reminder of the ideology that once ruled here. The story of Buchenwald is not only a story of death, it is a story of what happens when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked. It is a story of how ordinary people, doctors, bureaucrats, guards, can become instruments of genocide when driven by ideology and stripped of conscience. It is a story of how language, laws, and propaganda can turn neighbors into enemies and human beings into numbers. But it is also a story of resistance, of men and women who risked everything to save others, of children who survived unimaginable odds, and of survivors who chose to speak so that others might learn. Their testimony remains one of humanity's most powerful weapons against forgetting. Buchenwald was not built in a day, nor was it destroyed in one. It grew from years of hatred, racism, and indifference, and it fell when the world stood united against those forces. That is perhaps the most vital lesson it offers, that genocide does not begin with gas chambers. It begins with words, with policies, with silence. and it can only be stopped when people refuse to remain silent. When the gates of Buchenwald were thrown open in April 1945, the world was forced to confront the reality of what had happened there. Yet the liberation was not just the end of a story, it was the beginning of thousands of others. Among the emaciated figures emerging from the camp were survivors who would go on to become witnesses, chroniclers, and moral voices for generations to come. Through their words, the human dimension of Buchenwald, beyond statistics and documents, would finally be heard. One of the most famous of these witnesses was Elie Wiesel, a 16-year-old boy from Sighet, Romania, who had been deported with his family to Auschwitz in 1944. His mother and youngest sister were murdered in the gas chambers upon arrival. Elie and his father were later transferred to Buchenwald, where they endured months of starvation, disease, and brutality. In his memoir Night, Wiesel recalled the moment he saw his father die, beaten and left to perish in the barracks. "I did not weep, and it pained me that I could not weep. But I had no more tears. And in the depths of my being, in the recesses of my weakened conscience, could I have searched it, I might perhaps have found something like, 'Free at last.' It is one of the most haunting passages in Holocaust literature, a testament not only to grief but to the psychological devastation inflicted by the camps. Buchenwald did not just kill bodies. It stripped souls of their humanity, leaving survivors forever altered. Another survivor, Imre Kertész, a Hungarian teenager who was also deported to Buchenwald, described the disorientation of life in the camp in his Nobel Prize-winning memoir Fatelessness. "There was no need to know why, because everything happened according to a rule that I did not know but had to obey. I had to obey because that was the only way to remain alive." Kertész's words capture a core truth about Buchenwald. Survival depended not on strength or willpower alone, but on adapting to a system of arbitrary cruelty where human life had no value. Among the prisoners at Buchenwald were also prominent Jewish leaders and intellectuals who became symbols of endurance. One of them was Léon Blum, the former Prime Minister of France. Arrested by the Vichy regime and handed over to the Nazis, Blum spent years imprisoned before being transferred to Buchenwald in 1943. Though elderly and frail, Blum became a figure of hope for many fellow inmates. In secret discussions, he encouraged younger prisoners to hold on to their dignity and faith in a future beyond the barbed wire. His survival, and eventual liberation, was seen as a moral victory against the ideology that had sought to erase Jewish existence entirely. There were countless others whose names history never recorded. Rabbis who led whispered prayers in the barracks, doctors who risked their lives to treat the sick without medicine, and fathers who shared their rations so their sons might live another day. These acts of quiet defiance, though small in the face of vast evil, were profound expressions of humanity. Among the most heartbreaking chapters of the Buchenwald story is that of the children's barracks after liberation. Of the more than 21,000 prisoners found alive in the camp in April 1945, about 1,000 were children and teenagers, many of them Jewish orphans. They had been transported from the ghettos of Hungary, Poland, and France after losing their entire families to the Holocaust. One of them was Elie Wiesel. Another was Yehuda Bacon, a Czech teenager whose parents were murdered at Auschwitz. After liberation, Bacon recalled the surreal moment when American soldiers arrived. "We were afraid of them at first, afraid they were another group of guards. But then they gave us chocolate and bread, and we realized we were free." The US Army established special facilities to care for the children, providing medical treatment, food, and psychological support. They were referred to as the Buchenwald Boys, a group that included future scientists, artists, and activists. Many would later settle in Israel, the United States, or France, becoming lifelong advocates for Holocaust remembrance. One of the most touching accounts came from Jack Werber, a Polish survivor who helped organize care for the orphans. They were skin and bones, eyes too large for their faces. But they still played, they still laughed. That's when I knew Hitler had failed. They were alive, and they would carry our story forward. Survivors of Buchenwald understood that bearing witness was not merely an act of remembrance, it was a duty. In the months following liberation, they compiled testimonies, photographs, and documents to ensure that the crimes committed there could never be denied. Many gave evidence at the Nuremberg trials, recounting the atrocities they had witnessed. For Jewish survivors, memory itself became a form of resistance, a refusal to let the Nazis have the final word. As Elie Wiesel famously declared in a 1986 speech when accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Their testimonies revealed the full spectrum of Nazi crimes at Buchenwald, the beatings and executions, the medical experiments, the pseudo-scientific racial studies, the sadistic punishments, and the systematic starvation that claimed tens of thousands of lives. They also exposed the complicity of German industries that profited from slave labor and the ordinary citizens who looked away. In the aftermath of the war, Allied authorities sought to hold perpetrators accountable. The Buchenwald trials, held at Dachau in 1947, became one of the most significant legal proceedings against Nazi concentration camp personnel. 31 members of the SS staff were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Among the most notorious defendants was Ilse Koch, the wife of Commandant Karl Otto Koch. Known to prisoners as the Witch of Buchenwald, she was accused of selecting prisoners to be killed for their tattooed skin, which she allegedly turned into lampshades and book covers, though evidence for this specific charge was inconclusive. She was nonetheless convicted for her role in the camp's brutality and sentenced to life imprisonment. Other defendants included medical personnel who had conducted lethal experiments on prisoners, guards who had beaten inmates to death, and administrators who had overseen forced labor operations. Many were sentenced to death and executed. Yet for many survivors, justice felt incomplete. Thousands of perpetrators escaped trial, blending back into society and living out their lives in anonymity. In the post-war years, Buchenwald became a site of memory, but also of political struggle. Under Soviet occupation, the camp was briefly repurposed as a prison for Nazi officials and political dissidents. Later, in East Germany, it was transformed into a national memorial site, though the communist government emphasized the suffering of political prisoners over that of Jews. For decades, the specifically Jewish dimension of Buchenwald's history was downplayed or omitted from official narratives. It was not until after the fall of the Berlin Wall that a fuller picture of Buchenwald's past began to emerge. Historians and survivors worked tirelessly to document the experiences of Jewish prisoners, uncovering forgotten stories and restoring names to those who had been reduced to numbers. New exhibits and memorials were established, honoring the tens of thousands of Jews who perished there. Today, Buchenwald stands as one of the most powerful Holocaust memorial sites in the world. Visitors walk through the same gates that once bore the cruel inscription "Jedem das Sein," and inside they encounter the remnants of the barracks, the crematorium, the gallows. They read the names of the dead, see the faces of the survivors, and hear the echoes of their testimonies. The Holocaust can overwhelm us with its scale. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more persecuted. But behind every statistic is a human life, and Buchenwald was filled with such lives. There was Lotte Weiss, a young Jewish woman from Czechoslovakia, deported to Auschwitz and later transferred to Buchenwald's women's subcamp at Altenburg. She described the constant hunger and humiliation. The hunger was the worst. It was a fire that never went out. I thought only of food, a crust of bread, a potato peel. It consumed every thought. There was Norbert Wollheim, a German Jew who survived Buchenwald after losing his wife and child in Auschwitz. After the war, he became a leading advocate for reparations, suing E.G. Farben for its use of slave labor and winning a landmark settlement. There was Simon Wiesenthal, later a famed Nazi hunter who passed through Buchenwald before liberation. His experiences there fueled his lifelong pursuit of justice. When history looks back, I want people to know that the Nazis could not kill the idea that justice must be done. And there were countless unnamed victims, rabbis, musicians, tailors, merchants, whose stories were never recorded but whose lives mattered no less. Their absence is the silent testimony that haunts Buchenwald's ruins. While Buchenwald was not designed primarily as a death camp like Auschwitz or Treblinka, its role in the Holocaust was nonetheless central. It was a place where Jews were dehumanized, exploited, and murdered by the tens of thousands. It was a waypoint in the machinery of genocide, a holding cell, a labor site, a place where human life was systematically extinguished through starvation, disease, and brutality. But Buchenwald also occupies a unique place in Holocaust memory because of the voices that emerged from it. Survivors like Wiesel, Kertész, and Wiesenthal transformed their suffering into a moral call to action. Their words have shaped how the world understands not only the Holocaust, but the nature of evil itself. In this sense, Buchenwald is not merely a historical site. It is a warning, a monument to what happens when hatred becomes policy, when prejudice is written into law, and when indifference allows cruelty to flourish. It is a reminder that genocide is not committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who choose to see their neighbors as less than human. Today, more than 8 decades after its creation, Buchenwald's legacy continues to evolve. Survivors are now few in number, but their testimonies live on in archives, museums, and classrooms. Their stories are studied by historians, taught to students, and shared with millions online. Every year, thousands of visitors, many of them young people, walk through Buchenwald's gates. They stand in silence at the memorial stone, inscribed with the simple words, "To the memory of the victims." They read the names of the dead and reflect on the responsibilities of the living. For those who survived Buchenwald, memory is both burden and mission. As Elie Wiesel wrote, "For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear. His duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory." The survivors' voices call to us across the decades, not merely to remember what happened, but to act when hatred rises again, in whatever form it takes. Their message is not just about the past, it is about the future. In the vast landscape of Nazi terror, Buchenwald stands out not only for the suffering that occurred within its barbed wire fences, but also for the role it played in the broader structure of the Holocaust. To understand the camp's historical significance fully, it is necessary to examine it within the larger network of persecution and genocide that unfolded across Europe between 1933 and 1945. Buchenwald was not an isolated phenomenon. It was an integral component of a system built on ideology, bureaucracy, and violence. By the time Buchenwald opened in 1937, the Nazi regime had already established a network of camps designed to suppress political opposition and re-educate those considered enemies of the state. Early camps such as Dachau, established in 1933, served as prototypes. Buchenwald was conceived as a more advanced and permanent facility, one that could hold tens of thousands of prisoners and support the regime's expanding ambitions. Over time, the function of concentration camps evolved. What began as instruments of political repression soon became tools of racial persecution, economic exploitation, and mass murder. Buchenwald's place in this system was multifaceted transit and redistribution hub. Buchenwald served as an intermediate stop for Jewish prisoners deported from Western and Central Europe. Many spent weeks or months in the camp before being sent to extermination sites such as Auschwitz, Sobibor, or Chelmno. Forced labor center. The camp was a major source of slave labor for the German war industry, supplying workers to state-run enterprises and private companies. Ideological training ground, SS personnel assigned to Buchenwald were indoctrinated in Nazi racial theory and trained in methods of control, surveillance, and punishment. Many went on to serve in other camps, spreading the practices refined at Buchenwald throughout the Reich. Medical and racial experimentation site. Buchenwald was one of several camps used to conduct pseudo-scientific experiments on human subjects, particularly Jews and Roma, under the guise of medical research. In this sense, Buchenwald functioned as a microcosm of the entire Nazi concentration camp system. It was a site of imprisonment, exploitation, extermination, and indoctrination, and a key link in the chain of genocide. Buchenwald's internal organization was designed for maximum control and efficiency. At the top was the commandant, supported by a hierarchy of SS officers responsible for various aspects of camp operations: security, labor deployment, medical services, and record-keeping. This structure mirrored that of other camps and ensured a seamless connection to the wider SS bureaucracy. Below the SS leadership were Kapos, prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS to oversee daily operations in the barracks and work details. Many Kapos were criminals or political prisoners who used their positions to secure privileges. While some abused their authority, others attempted to mitigate the brutality of the system. The use of Kapos allowed the SS to maintain control with minimal personnel while fostering division and mistrust among prisoners. The camp itself was divided into distinct sections. Main camp contained barracks, administrative buildings, workshops, and the roll call square. Little camp, a segregated section with the worst living conditions, used primarily for Jews and those deemed unfit. Quarry and labor sites, where thousands performed backbreaking labor. Crematorium and medical facilities, sites of mass murder and experimentation. Subcamps, over 130 satellite camps and external labor sites linked to Buchenwald, extending its reach across central Germany. This spatial organization reflected the Nazis' dual priorities: economic exploitation and ideological extermination. Every structure served a purpose, and every prisoner was classified, categorized, and controlled. One of the most disturbing aspects of Buchenwald's history is the extent to which genocide and economic exploitation were intertwined. The Nazi regime viewed Jewish life not only as racially undesirable, but also as a resource to be extracted before annihilation. Slave labor became a central component of the war economy. As Germany faced manpower shortages due to the demands of the front, the SS expanded its cooperation with private industry. Buchenwald supplied tens of thousands of laborers to armaments manufacturers, construction companies, and chemical plants. Among the most prominent partners were IG Farben, Daimler-Benz, and Siemens, which built factories adjacent to or near the camp. Prisoners were leased to these companies for a daily fee, with the SS retaining the payments. The conditions were catastrophic. Work days stretched up to 14 hours, with minimal food and rest. Safety standards were non-existent, and exhaustion was considered a normal, even desirable, cause of death. The life expectancy of a laborer was measured in weeks. The economic role of Buchenwald illustrates a fundamental truth about the Holocaust. It was not only an ideological project, but also a deeply material one. Profit and extermination were not mutually exclusive, they were mutually reinforcing. The persecution of Jews in Buchenwald cannot be understood in isolation from Nazi racial ideology. From its inception, the camp system was built upon the pseudo-scientific belief in racial hierarchy. Jews were at the bottom of that hierarchy, portrayed as parasites, conspirators, and enemies of the Aryan race. This ideology justified every act of brutality within the camp. It allowed SS guards to see their victims not as human beings, but as vermin to be exterminated. It rationalized medical experiments, forced labor, and systematic starvation. It explained why Jewish prisoners were often denied medical treatment, excluded from prisoner self-administration, and subjected to the harshest punishments. Moreover, Nazi racial policy was not limited to Jews. Buchenwald also held thousands of Roma and Sinti, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and others labeled as undesirable. But the Jewish experience remained unique in its intensity and in the ideological fervor behind it. For Jews, survival in Buchenwald was never a question of re-education or rehabilitation. It was a race against a system designed to ensure their destruction. Although Buchenwald shared many characteristics with other concentration camps, its operations differed in important ways. Unlike Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, or Belzec, Buchenwald was not primarily an extermination camp equipped with gas chambers for industrial-scale killing. Most deaths there occurred through forced labor, starvation, disease, medical experiments, or execution by shooting and hanging. However, this distinction should not obscure the camp's lethal nature. Buchenwald's mortality rate was extraordinarily high. Approximately 56,000 people died there, including 38,000 to 40,000 Jews. These numbers rival the death tolls of some extermination camps and reflect the murderous efficiency of extermination through labor. Furthermore, Buchenwald's extensive network of subcamps gave it a reach far beyond its physical location. Camps such as Mittelbau-Dora, originally a subcamp of Buchenwald, became sites of mass death in their own right, where prisoners, many of them Jews, were worked to death building V-2 rockets for Germany's military program. One of the most important contributions Buchenwald made to post-war historical understanding of the Holocaust was the wealth of documentation that survived. Unlike camps that were hastily dismantled as the Allies advanced, Buchenwald was liberated largely intact. SS officers attempted to destroy records, but many were recovered, providing critical evidence for war crimes investigations and historical research. Documents included prisoner registration logs, transport lists, medical experiment reports, and records of executions. These materials allowed investigators to reconstruct the administrative machinery of genocide in unprecedented detail. They also revealed the extent of cooperation between the SS and private industry, highlighting the role of civilian sectors in sustaining the concentration camp system. Photographs and film footage taken by liberating American forces further solidified the evidentiary record. Images of skeletal survivors, stacked corpses, and functioning crematoria became central exhibits in the Nuremberg trials and remain among the most iconic visual testimonies of the Holocaust. The Buchenwald trials were part of a broader effort by the Allies to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. Held under U.S. military jurisdiction in Dachau from April to August 1947, the trials charged 31 individuals with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Defendants included SS officers, camp doctors, and capos who had committed atrocities against fellow prisoners. The proceedings revealed new details about the operation of the camp, including the extent of medical experimentation, the deliberate starvation policies, and the systematic targeting of Jews. The trials also exposed the personal motivations and psychological justifications of the perpetrators. Many claimed they were simply following orders, a defense that was repeatedly rejected by the tribunal. The trials resulted in 22 convictions, including 9 death sentences. While these verdicts represented a measure of justice, they also highlighted the limitations of post-war accountability. Thousands of lower-level perpetrators escaped prosecution, and many industrialists and bureaucrats who had profited from slave labor faced only mild consequences. After the war, Buchenwald's history took another dark turn. In August 1945, the Soviet NKVD, the precursor to the KGB, converted the site into a special internment camp for suspected Nazis, war criminals, and political opponents. Known as NKVD Special Camp No. 2, it held more than 28,000 prisoners between 1945 and 1950. Conditions were harsh, and an estimated 7,000 to 8,000 died due to disease and malnutrition. This period remains a controversial chapter in Buchenwald's history. While the site was used to punish Nazi perpetrators, it also became a tool of Soviet political repression. Many prisoners were held without trial, and some were innocent of serious crimes. This dual legacy complicates Buchenwald's post-war narrative, demonstrating how sites of oppression can be repurposed by successive regimes. The transformation of Buchenwald into a memorial site began in earnest in the 1950s, when the East German government established a state-sponsored museum and monument. The memorial emphasized the suffering of political prisoners, especially communists, in line with the ideological priorities of the socialist state. The Jewish experience, while acknowledged, was often minimized or subsumed under a broader narrative of anti-fascist resistance. This approach began to change after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Reunified Germany undertook a comprehensive reassessment of the site's history, expanding exhibits to include the full spectrum of victims, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and others, and incorporating survivor testimonies and archival materials into the interpretation. Today, the Buchenwald Memorial is one of the most significant Holocaust sites in Europe. It features preserved barracks, the crematorium, the gatehouse, and extensive museum exhibitions. Educational programs bring thousands of students, scholars, and visitors each year to confront the realities of Nazi persecution and genocide. Buchenwald has also become a center for scholarly research on the Holocaust and the Nazi concentration camp system. The memorial's archives house tens of thousands of documents, photographs, and personal testimonies. Historians have used this material to explore topics such as the evolution of Nazi racial policy, the economics of forced labor, and the psychology of perpetrators and victims. Educational initiatives emphasize critical thinking and moral reflection. Visitors are encouraged not only to learn about historical facts, but also to consider the broader implications for contemporary society, including the dangers of racism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism. Buchenwald occupies a central place in global Holocaust remembrance. It is frequently referenced in literature, film, and academic scholarship. Its liberation by US forces and the testimonies of survivors like Elie Wiesel have made it one of the most documented and symbolically powerful sites of Nazi atrocity. The camp's history also plays a vital role in international Holocaust education. Programs such as the March of the Living, which bring students and educators to former concentration and extermination camps, often include visits to Buchenwald as part of a broader exploration of Nazi crimes. In Israel, the United States, and Europe, Buchenwald is invoked not only as a site of Jewish suffering, but as a warning about the fragility of democratic institutions and the ease with which prejudice can be transformed into policy. The slogan, "Never Again," is deeply connected to places like Buchenwald, reminders of what happens when hatred goes unchecked. Historians continue to debate aspects of Buchenwald's history, including the precise death toll, the dynamics of prisoner resistance, and the relationships between different victim groups. Some scholars emphasize the uniqueness of the Jewish experience, while others highlight the camp's broader function as a site of political repression and forced labor. Another area of ongoing research concerns the role of ordinary Germans. Evidence suggests that many local residents were aware of the camp's existence and profited from its operations. The question of societal complicity remains central to understanding how the Holocaust was possible, and how similar atrocities might be prevented in the future. The future of Holocaust memory, including that of Buchenwald, faces new challenges. As the last survivors pass away, the responsibility for preserving their testimonies shifts to historians, educators, and institutions. At the same time, rising anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and historical revisionism underscore the urgency of continued education and vigilance. As the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, the physical structures of the Nazi concentration camp system lay in ruins. But the legacy of those places, and the crimes committed within them, was only beginning to be understood. Among those dark sites, Buchenwald would emerge not just as a symbol of human cruelty, but also as a crucial key to understanding how genocide is conceived, executed, and remembered. For survivors of Buchenwald, liberation was not the end of suffering. In many ways, it was the beginning of a new, painful chapter. The men, women, and children who walked out of the camp's gates were often alone in the world. Families had been annihilated, homes destroyed, and entire communities erased from the map of Europe. Many survivors weighed less than 40 kilograms, suffered from tuberculosis and typhus, and were psychologically scarred by years of abuse and dehumanization. Humanitarian organizations, including the American Joint Distribution Committee, the International Red Cross, and Jewish relief groups, established displaced persons camps to house survivors. Medical care was provided, and efforts began to trace missing relatives. But the trauma was profound. Many survivors were haunted by nightmares, guilt over having lived when others had perished, and a deep sense of alienation from a world that had stood by while their people were slaughtered. For Jewish survivors in particular, the return to pre-war homes was often impossible. Antisemitism persisted in many parts of Europe, and entire Jewish communities had been wiped out. This led to a massive wave of migration to Palestine and later Israel, the United States, South America, and other parts of the world. The Buchenwald boys, as the orphaned children rescued from the camp were called, played a significant role in the rebuilding of Jewish life in Israel and the diaspora. The atrocities of Buchenwald and the Holocaust as a whole forced humanity to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, civilization, and the nature of evil. How could a society known for its culture, science, and philosophy become capable of such barbarism? How could ordinary men and women participate in, or ignore, genocide? These questions shaped post-war thought in profound ways. Jewish philosophers and theologians grappled with the theological implications of the Holocaust. Figures like Emil Fackenheim argued that Jews bore a new commandment: to survive and bear witness, so that Hitler would not achieve a posthumous victory. Thinkers such as Hannah Arendt examined the banality of evil, showing how ordinary bureaucrats could become cogs in a genocidal machine without personal hatred or sadistic intent. Survivors themselves contributed significantly to this moral reckoning. Elie Wiesel's writings challenged humanity to confront indifference as much as hatred. "The opposite of love is not hate," he wrote, "it's indifference." Buchenwald was not built in a day. It was built brick by brick, policy by policy, silence by silence. This understanding transformed how the world approached questions of human rights and justice. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the Genocide Convention, 1948, and the creation of the State of Israel, 1948, were all, in part, responses to the Holocaust's horrors. Buchenwald was one of the many sites that proved beyond doubt that the world could never again afford to ignore crimes against humanity. As the decades passed, the survivors' testimonies became increasingly vital. Holocaust denial, a movement that seeks to minimize or outright deny the genocide, emerged almost immediately after the war. Some deniers claimed that the concentration camps were labor camps rather than sites of murder. Others argued that the numbers of Jewish victims were exaggerated. Buchenwald's meticulously documented history has been one of the most powerful tools against such falsehoods. The camp's records, preserved by both the Nazis and the Allies, include transport lists, execution orders, medical experiment logs, and detailed prisoner files. The liberation photographs and films taken by American forces provided irrefutable visual evidence, and the testimonies of thousands of survivors given in courtrooms, classrooms, and public forums have ensured that the historical record remains unassailable. Holocaust education has become a cornerstone of this effort. Museums such as Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and the Buchenwald Memorial itself play a critical role in preserving memory. School curricula across Europe, Israel, and North America include Holocaust studies, often incorporating visits to former camps. These programs emphasize not just what happened, but why it happened, and how such atrocities can be prevented in the future. Memory, however, is not static. The way societies remember Buchenwald and the Holocaust has evolved over time. In the immediate post-war decades, remembrance was often focused on national narratives, resistance movements, liberation, and the triumph of democracy over fascism. Jewish suffering, while acknowledged, was frequently subsumed under a broader story of wartime tragedy. By the late 20th century, that began to change. The Holocaust became recognized as a unique event, an attempt to systematically exterminate an entire people using the full machinery of a modern state. This shift was influenced by survivor testimony, scholarship, and cultural works such as films, novels, and documentaries that brought the human stories of the Holocaust to mass audiences. Buchenwald played a central role in this evolving memory culture. Its proximity to Weimar, a symbol of German culture and enlightenment, became a powerful metaphor. The coexistence of Goethe's legacy and the crematorium's chimney forced Germany and the world to confront the uncomfortable reality that culture and barbarism can exist side by side. Today, remembrance is increasingly global. International Holocaust Remembrance Day, observed on January 27th each year, commemorates the liberation of Auschwitz, but also honors victims from camps like Buchenwald. Memorial ceremonies often feature survivor testimonies, readings of names, and reflections on the continuing relevance of the Holocaust's lessons. The legacy of Buchenwald extends far beyond historical memory. It informs modern debates about genocide, human rights, and international law. The post-war cry of never again has been invoked in the face of atrocities in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and Syria. Yet these events also demonstrate how fragile that promise remains. Holocaust scholars and human rights advocates argue that the lessons of Buchenwald must guide responses to modern crises. Early warning signs, hate speech, scapegoating of minorities, erosion of democratic institutions, are often dismissed until it is too late. The Holocaust teaches that genocide is not a sudden event. It is a process that begins with prejudice and ends with gas chambers. Moreover, Buchenwald highlights the dangers of dehumanization. The Nazis did not need every German to become a murderer. They needed them to stop seeing Jews as human. That process, of stripping away empathy and reducing people to stereotypes, is visible today in xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of hatred. Remembering Buchenwald is therefore not just about honoring the dead. It is about recognizing and confronting those same dynamics whenever they appear. As the 21st century progresses, the generation of Buchenwald survivors is nearing its end. Most are now in their 90s or older. Each year, fewer return to the site for commemorations. With their passing, the responsibility for preserving their memory will rest entirely on the next generations. Survivors have long been aware of this inevitability, and many devoted their later lives to education and advocacy. Elie Wiesel lectured around the world on the dangers of hatred and indifference. Imre Kertész continued to write about the Holocaust's impact on identity and morality. Countless others spoke in schools, testified in war crimes trials, and participated in oral history projects. Their message is consistent and urgent. Memory is not passive. It is a responsibility. It must be renewed with every generation. As Wiesel once said, "When you listen to a witness, you become a witness." This concept, that remembrance is a living act, is central to the legacy of Buchenwald. The camp's history is not just something to be studied in books or museums. It is a call to vigilance, empathy, and action. Today, Buchenwald stands as both a historical site and a space for dialogue. Scholars from around the world conduct research in its archives, students visit as part of educational programs. Politicians and diplomats lay wreaths at memorial ceremonies, reaffirming commitments to human rights and democratic values. The memorial's exhibitions present not only the history of the camp, but also the broader story of the Holocaust and the dangers of totalitarianism. Interactive displays explore how Nazi ideology developed, how ordinary people became perpetrators, and how propaganda shaped public opinion. Visitors are invited to reflect on their own societies, to ask how prejudice and intolerance manifest today, and what can be done to stop them. In recent years, Buchenwald has also become a space for addressing new forms of anti-Semitism and historical distortion. As conspiracy theories and hate speech proliferate online, Holocaust memorials have adapted, using digital platforms to reach younger audiences and combat misinformation. Virtual tours, survivor testimony archives, and educational apps now complement traditional exhibitions. More than 80 years after its construction, Buchenwald remains one of history's most powerful warnings. It demonstrates that genocide is not inevitable, but neither is it impossible. It shows how a modern, industrialized society can descend into barbarism when hatred is normalized and democracy is dismantled. It teaches that indifference is a dangerous ally of evil. It also illustrates the resilience of the human spirit. Amid starvation, torture, and death, prisoners formed bonds of solidarity, engaged in acts of resistance, and preserved their dignity. Even in the darkest conditions, they maintained a belief, however faint, in a future free from tyranny. Perhaps most importantly, Buchenwald forces us to confront the reality that history is not past. The ideologies that created the Holocaust, racism, anti-Semitism, ultranationalism, still exist. They have different forms and faces today, but their essence remains unchanged. The lessons of Buchenwald will only remain relevant if they are remembered, taught, and acted upon. As we conclude this exploration of Buchenwald's history, from its construction in 1937 to its liberation in 1945, from the suffering of its Jewish prisoners to the global legacy it left behind, one truth becomes clear. This was not merely a camp. It was a mirror held up to humanity. In its barracks, we see the depths of cruelty of which humans are capable. In its resistance networks, we see courage and solidarity. In the testimonies of survivors, we see pain, but also perseverance. Buchenwald reminds us that history is not an abstract lesson. It is a warning. It asks each generation to examine its own values and choices. It demands that we reject hatred in all its forms and protect the dignity and humanity of every individual. The gates of Buchenwald now stand open, their iron inscription still visible. Jedem das Sein, to each his own. Once, those words mocked the suffering of the condemned. Today, they serve as a solemn reminder of the consequences of hatred and the responsibility of remembrance. The survivors are leaving us, but their message endures. Never forget, never be indifferent, never again. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.